We didn't plan to start this one with laughter. It arrived on its own, thin and misplaced, the kind that hangs in a room a second too long. We remember noticing how still she stayed when it happened, how nothing in her posture asked for mercy. Iris Montgomery was there because she had to be, because family history has a way of calling you back even when you've already learned what it costs. What follows is her voice. I was seated near the end of the table, hands folded the way I'd practiced since childhood. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. My father sat closer to the head, relaxed, already leaning back as if the meeting were decided. Nathan kept checking his phone. No one looked at me. The attorney cleared his throat and continued reading. Properties, dividends, board appointments. My mother nodded along, composed. When my name came, it was quick. To Iris Montgomery, he read, eyes fixed on the page. $10. For a beat. Nothing. Then the sound moved. A soft laugh from my mother. Someone exhaled through their nose. My father shook his head, almost kindly, like this was a lesson he'd tried to teach before. I didn't move. I felt the heat rise anyway, slow and familiar. $10 wasn't a loss. It was a message. It said I'd been seen, weighed, and dismissed. Across the table, my father leaned forward just enough. Artistic paths don't always pay off. The words landed gently. That was the cruelty of them. We noticed, later, how the room didn't rush to comfort her. No one interrupted the moment. It was allowed to settle. I kept my eyes on the grain of the table. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with my grandfather. Not the words. Just the silence after them. The attorney moved on. My name wasn't mentioned again. When the meeting adjourned, my father stood and straightened his jacket. Nathan finally looked up. Curious now, not concerned. I stayed seated a second longer than necessary. If you're still listening, take a breath with me here. Some stories don't break loudly. They split quietly, and you don't feel it until you try to stand. I gathered my coat and followed the others out, already understanding that whatever had just been taken from me wasn't money, and that whatever came next wouldn't ask permission. The hallway outside the conference room narrowed the sound of everyone at once. Shoes on tile, coats sliding off chairbacks. My mother reached for her purse before she reached for me. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," she said, eyes already scanning for the elevator. My father smiled like he was smoothing a wrinkle. "You've always wanted to do things your way. This is just the outcome." Nathan laughed under his breath. "At least it's honest." I followed them toward the doors. The guard held one open. No one thanked him. That felt familiar too. In the elevator, my father stood closest to the panel. He pressed the button for the lobby, then glanced at me like he'd remembered something late. "You could still come by the office next week. Sit in. Learn how things work." My chest tightened. "I've been learning how things work." He waved it off. "Not like this." The doors closed. The elevator hummed. My mother fixed the collar of his coat. Careful. Practiced. Nathan leaned against the wall. "Scrolling. You never wanted what we built," my father added, softer now. "You wanted attention." The words landed. They always did. We noticed how no one raised their voice, how everything stayed polite, almost tender, while the distance widened. When the doors opened, they stepped out together. I lingered half a second, then joined them. Outside, my father stopped and turned. "Don't disappear," he said. "Family is family." I nodded. It was easier than arguing, easier than explaining that I hadn't disappeared. I'd just stopped waiting to be chosen. They walked ahead, already discussing dinner. I watched their backs until they blended into the crowd, then turned the other way, carrying the quiet weight of a family that had made its choice long before that room, long before the number was read aloud. I didn't go straight home after that day. I walked until the noise thinned out, then ducked into a cafe I used to work from when I was freelancing. Same chipped counter, Same barista who never remembered my name, but remembered my order. Still black, she asked. Yeah, still black. I took the cup to the back table and opened my laptop. Old habit. When things felt unstable, I looked at numbers, patterns, context. It was how I'd learned to stay steady. People liked to say I chose art over reality. That always annoyed me. I didn't choose one thing. I studied visual communication because images move people. I learned data analytics because stories don't survive without proof. I worked brand strategy jobs where no one cared who my family was, only whether my thinking held up in a room full of skeptics. Once, a year earlier, I'd brought a deck to my father's office, market shifts, declining divisions, opportunities he didn't want to see. He flipped through it fast, then slid it back. You think too much like an outsider. I think like the customer. That's the problem. We remember noticing how she didn't argue after that, how she gathered her things quietly, already adjusting. Back at the cafe, my phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. Rough day. Want a drink later. I stared at it, then turned the screen face down. The coffee had gone cold. I drank it anyway. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was trying to understand how systems fail, how they resist change, and why the people inside them confuse control with strength. I closed the laptop, slipped it into my bag, and stood. Whatever my family thought I lacked, I'd built something else in its place. They just hadn't bothered to look. I hadn't planned to see my grandfather that afternoon. I was in Pittsburgh for work, killing time between meetings, when I found myself standing across the street from his old office. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just finally seeing it clearly. He answered the door himself. Slower, thinner, but sharp-eyed. You're early, he noted, stepping aside anyway. Inside, everything was where it had always been, papers stacked neatly. A single mug by the window, ringed from years of use. He poured tea without asking, slid a cup toward me, then sat across the desk like this was a meeting that mattered. So, he began, folding his hands. If you controlled the company tomorrow, what would you let die? The question landed heavy, not unkind, just exact. I took a breath. 2 divisions should have been sold years ago. They drain cash and morale. The brand's strong, but the structure's outdated. He nodded once. And your brother, I hesitated. He wants the title, not the work. Silence stretched. The clock ticked. I felt the urge to soften it, to make it sound nicer. I didn't. That honesty, he said finally, costs people. I know. We noticed how he didn't interrupt her, how he let the discomfort sit between them, like something useful. He leaned back, studying me. Most people protect what they build. Very few protect what comes next. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything to add. When I stood to leave, he rose too, slower now. At the door, he paused. Whatever happens, he said quietly, don't confuse silence with weakness. I nodded, unsure what to do with that. Outside, the air felt cooler. I stood there a moment, replaying the conversation, unaware that it would be the last one we'd have, or that he'd already made a decision I wouldn't understand until much later. The days after the funeral blurred together. Calls I didn't return. Emails marked urgent that weren't meant for me anyway. I stayed busy on purpose. It kept the noise down. Jonathan Reeves reached out the following week. A short message. Can we talk? Privately. We met in his office late, after most of the floor had emptied. He didn't offer coffee, just closed the door and leaned against it like he needed the support. You should know. He started, then stopped. His jaw tightened. There was more. I stayed quiet, let him find his way through it. Your grandfather held a majority of the voting shares, 51%. He placed them in a separate voting trust. You were named as the successor. The room felt smaller. That wasn't red. He shook his head. I was instructed not to. Instructed by who? His phone buzzed on the desk. He silenced it without looking. Your father made it clear there would be consequences if I didn't follow the version presented. For you. For my family. The word family sat there between us. Heavy and misplaced. We noticed how his voice dropped when he said it, how careful he became with every word that followed. I documented everything, he added, emails, voicemails, the pressure. I couldn't correct it then. But I didn't destroy it either. I felt a strange calm settle in. Not relief, not anger, just clarity. Why tell me now? He met my eyes. Because the truth doesn't disappear just because it's delayed. When I left, the hallway lights were dimmed. My reflection followed me in the glass. I thought of my grandfather's question. What would you let die? At the time, I'd thought he meant divisions. I understood now he'd meant illusions. My grandmother didn't call me right away. That was the first thing I noticed. She'd always been precise about timing. Birthdays at 8 in the morning. Thank you notes mailed the next day. Silence from her meant something was moving underneath it. When she did ask me to come by, her voice was calm. Bring a coat. It's colder than it looks. Her apartment smelled like lemon oil and old books. She poured tea, slid the cup toward me, then sat without saying anything for a long moment. You looked surprised at the reading, she said at last. I was... She nodded. So was I. I didn't fill the space. I'd learned not to rush her. I asked Jonathan for copies. She continued, fingers resting lightly on the saucer. Of everything. That was quick. It needed to be. Her eyes lifted to mine. Your grandfather didn't change his mind at the end. He hated indecision. My throat tightened. My father told me it was settled. She gave a small, almost amused breath. Your father talks when he's nervous. We noticed how she didn't raise her voice, how certainty didn't need volume. She stood and crossed to the window. Outside, traffic moved steadily, indifferent. I've asked someone to look into a few things. Phone records, timelines. For what? For pressure, she said, and for fear. I sat back, the chair creaking softly. What do you want me to do? For now, she replied, turning back with the cup still in her hand. Nothing at all. I left a little later, coat buttoned wrong, mind racing. She hadn't promised anything. She hadn't explained everything. But for the first time since the reading, I wasn't alone with it. The boardroom in Pittsburgh was colder than it needed to be. Long table. Water glasses lined up but untouched. My father stood near the screen, already mid-sentence when my grandmother walked in. She didn't apologize for being late. Before you continue, Margaret said, setting her folder down, there's something the board needs to see. My father's smile tightened. This isn't the time. It is, she replied, calm as ever. She nodded toward Jonathan Reeves, seated halfway down the table. You should start. Jonathan cleared his throat. His hands shook just enough to notice. There was a voting trust executed by Harold Montgomery. It transferred a controlling interest upon his death. My brother shifted in his chair. That's not accurate. Jonathan didn't look at him. It is. 51% of the voting shares. The words landed and didn't bounce. My father stepped forward. You already read the will. I read what I was instructed to read, Jonathan said. I kept records of the rest. Margaret opened her folder. Emails, call logs, dates, times. The room filled with paper sounds. Someone near the end of the table leaned back slowly, like the air had changed pressure. We noticed how no one interrupted her, how even the loud ones waited. My father's voice dropped. This is unnecessary. She met his eyes. So was the intimidation. Silence. Then the chair across from me scraped as a board member stood. Is the trust valid? Jonathan nodded, filed, witnessed, enforceable. Another pause. A longer one. The vote was procedural after that. Quick, unanimous. My brother stared at the table. My father looked past me, like I'd moved without him noticing. Margaret turned slightly in her seat. Iris. I stood. My knees felt steady. That surprised me. I'm not here to replace anyone today, I said. I'm here to make sure the company survives what comes next. No one argued. As the meeting adjourned, people avoided my father's eyes. He gathered his papers slowly, carefully, like speed might give something away. I stayed where I was for a moment, hand resting on the back of my chair. The room didn't feel triumphant. It felt corrected. The changes didn't happen all at once. That was intentional. I stayed in Pittsburgh for the week, meeting people in small groups. Operations first, finance after. I asked questions and waited through the answers. Some were defensive, some relieved. One executive leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. So what's the plan? For today, I told him. Nothing dramatic. He blinked. That's it. That's enough. Word traveled fast anyway. My father stopped coming in. Nathan sent a text that stayed unread. The building felt calmer without either of them. At the end of the week, I sat across from the head of manufacturing. His hands were rough, nails bitten down. Are we closing? Not you, I said. Not if you're willing to adapt. His shoulders dropped an inch. We noticed how she didn't raise her voice, how decisions came without theater. Later, Margaret joined me for lunch in the cafeteria. Same table she'd eaten at decades earlier. You're not punishing them, she observed, stirring her soup. No, I replied. I'm just not protecting them anymore. She nodded once, approval without ceremony. That night, I walked the factory floor alone, lights low, machines quiet but waiting. I rested my hand on the railing and stood there longer than planned, letting the quiet settle into something steady. The factory sounded different once the decision settled, not louder, just steadier. I started spending mornings there before anyone else arrived, coffee cooling in my hand, walking the same floor my grandfather once did. In my office, the $10 check sat in a simple frame on the shelf, not hidden, not centered, just there. A marker. Some days I noticed it. Some days I didn't. My father never called. Nathan sent one last message a month later. A photo of a drink somewhere warm. No words. I didn't answer. The space that followed felt cleaner than closure. Margaret stopped by once, stood beside me at the window. You look settled, she said. I feel quieter. I replied. That seemed closer to the truth. When she left, I stayed put, watching the shift change below. People laughing, complaining, moving on. The company was still a company, but it wasn't pressing down on me anymore. What changed wasn't the title or the vote. It was how I carried myself through the day. Iris Montgomery didn't need to wait for permission now. I trusted my instincts. I slept better. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. If this story stays with you for a moment after it ends, that's enough. Some things don't need an audience to matter. I turned off the light, locked the door, and went home, knowing the silence I'd earned would stay with me.